Some of you have told me that very late on Saturday nights, you tune into our online worship service. And others of you have told me that you get up early Sunday morning to watch. Starting next Sunday, we're going to be broadcasting our 11 a.m. worship service from Mount Pleasant live. And so starting next Sunday, you won't be able to access our worship service online until after 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then we'll post the worship service on our website and you'll be able to access it anytime. If you're living in Metro Vancouver, we would love to have you join us in person for one of our worship services at one of our 5 sites as we are gathering now in person. Most children don't think about the end of their life very much. When I was a kid, I would wonder, what are we having for dinner tonight? Or I'd be daydreaming at school about a road hockey game I was looking forward to after school on the cul-de-sac in front of our home. Or I'd be thinking about some TV program I wanted to watch, like Gilligan's Island or The Brady Bunch. If I thought about death at all, it was a very fleeting thought. As we grow older, we think about death more regularly, but it still remains very abstract and far away. A pastor I know is 71 years old. And last year in February, so this would be just before the pandemic, he was traveling from Malaysia back home to New York City when he developed this intestinal infection. So when he got home, he booked an appointment with his doctor, had a scan, and the scan seemed to show that he had these enlarged lymph nodes in his abdomen. The doctor said, no cause for concern, but why don't you come back in a few months just to check? Well, at the follow-up appointment a few months later, he learned that he had pancreatic cancer. And he thought to himself, what? No, this can't be happening to me. Death doesn't happen to me, it happens to other people. This pastor had spoken with countless people about their death. He had even written a book about death. But when he first realized he had pancreatic cancer, he was in denial about his own probable earlier than expected death. Ernest Becker was a professor at Simon Fraser University here in Burnaby. And he wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death. And in that book, Professor Becker points out that all human beings have a terror of death, but we suppress our fear by denying it. He says we deny death by trying to contribute something heroic to the world. Or we deny death by pursuing a romance or chasing pleasure or entertaining ourselves or just getting busy and distracting ourselves. We've been in a series in the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. And the central character, King Solomon, or someone taking on Solomon's persona, has been on this quest for meaning. And in the text we're going to look at today from Ecclesiastes 7, he will urge us not to deny death, but to face it squarely. In Ecclesiastes 7, 1-4, he writes these words: "A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. For death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. Frustration is better than laughter, because the sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure." May God speak to us through these words today. Now, in Ecclesiastes 3, this poem that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, the searcher for meaning says there is a time to mourn and a time to dance. There is a time to weep and a time to laugh. And Scripture tells us that dancing and laughter and joy are good things, whether on Thanksgiving Sunday or Monday or on any day. So when the searcher says in verse 2, it is better to go to a house of mourning than to a house of feasting, what does he mean? He's saying in the context that insofar as acquiring wisdom is concerned, it is better to go to a house of mourning where there has been death or a reminder that life is brief than to go to a house of birth. Now, obviously, the birth of a baby is a wonderful, joyous, and great occasion. But the searcher for meaning is saying that the house of mourning or the house of death will be more instructive. It will impart more wisdom than the house that gives birth. Saint Dominic once said, "Death will kill a man, but the thought of death can save him." Or death will kill a woman, but the thought of death can save her. Several years ago, I had an opportunity to spend a few days in silence at a Benedictine monastery in Big Sur, California. And as I was checking in, the monk behind the counter asked me, "So how did you find out about New Camaldoli Monastery?" And I said, "Well, the journalist Pico Iyer, who writes for the New York Times, gave a TED Talk that I watched. And in the TED Talk, he actually recommended this place." And the monk's eyes lit up and said, "Pico Iyer, he checked in about an hour ago, and I think he's staying 2 doors down from you." It was supposed to be a silent retreat, but I saw Pico in the bookstore talking to the abbot of the monastery. And so a little while later, when he was alone, I approached him and said, "Excuse me, I know this is a silent retreat, but I just wanted to mention that I love your writing, and the reason I'm here at the monastery is because you recommended this place in your TED Talk." And Pico said, I'm glad to meet you. We should get together and have a conversation. We should get together and talk tonight." And so we met up in the chapel, and we had this great conversation. And partway during our talk together, I said something like, "Pico, from what I can gather, you're not a religious person. You're not sure of God's existence, so you're not sure you believe in God. Why is it that you come regularly to this Christian monastery?" And Pico said, "There are 2 things that bring me real clarity in life. One is when I receive a phone call telling me that a loved one has just 6 months to live. And as I'm walking down the hall of the hospital to go visit this loved one, I don't care where they went to school or what their title is or how much money they have in the bank. When I'm walking toward them, when I'm in their presence, what's most important becomes really clear. So being faced with death brings real clarity to me. And the other thing that brings me real clarity is silence. And that's why I come to the monastery at least once a year and ideally twice." There's something about death or the thought of death and silence that can shed us of the superficial and clarify what is most important in life. And in this message, the searcher for meaning suggests that being exposed to death or the brevity of life can bring us real wisdom. Now, as we've been seeing in this series, this searcher has been on a quest for meaning. He's been diving into oceans of knowledge. He's been chasing pleasure. He's been going after success and fame and has achieved all these things. But he says, under the sun, that is, if I experience these things only under the sun, that is without God, they're all meaningless. They are chasing wind. They're trying to grasp smoke. And as we've seen, he concludes that the only way to find meaning in life is to look above the sun, to look toward our Creator. But in this passage that we're looking at today, the searcher for meaning also seems to suggest that if we will live our lives conscious of our coming death, we will live life with more meaning. And I've been reminded of this as I've been thinking about my mother. As many of you now know, if you're regulars, this past summer, my mother discovered that her cancer had come back. And as it came back, my mom had a deeper desire to live and to express herself really honestly. It wasn't like, before this time she lived dishonestly. She wouldn't consciously break the law or do something to violate her conscience. But as she realized her days were numbered, and even before this, she had this growing desire to live and to express herself really honestly. And so when our family found out that Mom's cancer had come back, we gathered around her bed and we took some time to share memories about her and to offer her some tributes. And when Joey decided to speak, it wasn't like we were going in a circle, but when our adolescent son, Joey, decided to speak, he blurted out something like, Grandma, thank you for the cash gift that you just gave me for my birthday. It was a generous cash gift. And thank you for all those chocolate cupcakes you made me, etc. And my mom just beamed at him and said, Joey, you're just so authentic. You're just so honest. You just say what's on your mind. I want to be like you. I respect you. You're my teacher. And as Mom realized that her days were numbered, she really did want to live and express herself more honestly and straightforwardly. A lot of people, as they realize that their end is in sight, they regret not having the courage to express things across their lifetime. It might have been an expression of love or affection that they wanted to utter, or some word of affirmation they wanted to convey, but they just felt too embarrassed, too awkward to say that. Or maybe they look back and they realize that they ought to have said something hard. They ought to have communicated the hard truth to someone, but they didn't want to rock the boat. And they regret that. Parker Palmer is this very wise Quaker elder who's now in his early 80s. And in his book, On the Brink of Everything, Grace, Gravity, and Getting Old, he writes, as I think about my own death, I don't want to hunker down, but I want to show up for my life. Love that. Parker's in his 80s, as I mentioned, and as he thinks about his death, he says, I don't want to hunker down in my old age. I want to show up for my life. I want to show up. I think that's a great desire to have at any age. As my colleagues Craig and Laura mentioned in their sermons last Sunday, Bronnie Ware for many years was a palliative care nurse in Australia. And based on her experiences with the dying, she wrote a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. And according to the conversations that she had with people, the number one regret that her dying patients had was, I wish I had had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. I I wish I had had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. And many of her patients regretted how they had lived their life based on the scripts that other people had given them or the expectations that other people had of them, and that they hadn't honored their deepest longings and desires. According to nurse Bronnie Ware, most of her patients, as they were dying, had not even honored half of their dreams. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11, and here the searcher is primarily speaking toward the young, but hear this at any age. 11:9, he writes, "Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment." And so the searcher for meaning is saying, follow your heart. Honor your deep longings and desires. Lean into life and enjoy life. But just be mindful that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. Now, we read that line about one day standing before God on Judgment Day as a kind of word of caution, as a kind of warning. And perhaps we should. But as the respected commentator C.L. Seow observes, we human beings are called by God to enjoy life. And one day God will hold us to account for our failure to enjoy life. So the searcher for meaning is saying, honor your deep desires. You can do this whether you're young or old or somewhere in between. The author, Mary Pfeiffer, in her wise book, Another Country, Navigating the Emotional Terrain of Our Elders, says that when you realize death is coming and you think to yourself, I may only be able to walk this beach 7 more times. There's something about that knowledge that causes you to savor that walk, to really enjoy it. The pastor that I mentioned who has pancreatic cancer says that as he faces death, there's never been more grief that has risen up in his soul, but there's also never been more joy that he's known as he really savors life and the gifts of God and the people in his world. And so the searcher for meaning tells us that death, or the thought of death, can bring us wisdom. It can be an invitation, as my mother had experienced, to live a life more true to yourself, to live more honestly and express yourself more freely. It can be an invitation to honor your deepest longings and desires and to savor life. Are you doing that no matter what your age? According to Bronnie Ware, another of the top 5 regrets, and both Craig and Laura mentioned this in their messages as well, was, I wish I had stayed in touch with friends. You know, as people grow older, they often look back on their lives and they realize the importance of friendships and relationships. Belinda grew up on the prairies. And when her parents discovered that she was gay, they basically disowned her. Belinda kept in touch with her sister, but otherwise heard nothing from her parents and her brothers for 20 years or so. Belinda ended up working in a city far away, and she would sometimes send letters home, but they would be returned to her unopened. She had stayed in touch with her sister, and one day her sister called to let Belinda know that their dad had cancer. Belinda herself was in her 40s at this time, and she immediately called her mom and offered to help. And to Belinda's surprise, her mom started crying and accepted her offer for help, in part because her mother could actually use the help, but also as her mother saw that her husband, Belinda's father, had cancer. She was reminded of how brief life is and how much she missed her daughter, Belinda, and how much she really valued that relationship. And again, no matter what our age, when we recognize how brief life on earth is, we tend to value relationships more. And the thought of death or being exposed to death and the brevity of life can inspire us to invest in a relationship, to maintain a relationship, to reconnect with someone with whom we have been estranged. Now, obviously, there are certain cases where relationships cannot be repaired. There are other relationships that should not be reestablished, perhaps because there were abusive actions in that relationship or some other reason. But even if we have been hurt in a relationship, and pretty much all of us have been if we've lived long enough, a reminder through death that life is brief can inspire us. And I realize this is a process, but we can be inspired to, with God's help, let go of our anger and bitterness and forgive. I find Najwa Zebian's words so helpful. She says, "Today, I decided to forgive you. Not because you apologized or because you acknowledged the pain you caused me, but because my soul deserves peace." Love those words. Today I decided to forgive you. Not because you apologized or because you acknowledged the hurt you caused me, but because my soul deserves peace. And so death, or the thought of death, can teach us how fleeting life is. And it can be an invitation for us to live and express ourselves honestly, to honor our deepest longings and desires. It can also cause us to value our relationships more. Another one of the top 5 regrets that Bronnie Ware, the palliative care nurse, listed was, "I wish I didn't work so hard." So this, again, came from her patients. As her patients approached death, many people regretted spending so much time and energy chasing money or titles or honors. And they regretted missing their children's youth or the companionship of a partner or a friend. And many people felt, I wish I had been willing to simplify my lifestyle. And I wouldn't have had to work so much, and I could have spent more time with people and the things that are most important in life. I remember spending time with a pastor in New York City who had been a kind of mentor to me. We were sharing a bagel, and he had thyroid cancer. And so I sort of gently raised the subject and said, "What was it like for you to have had cancer?" And he responded across the table by saying, what do you mean? What's it like not to be dead? And I said, yeah, I guess. What did you learn from that, or did it change your perspective? And this pastor said, having cancer made me feel like I never wanted to do anything again just because it was a, quote, honor to do something. So he said, for example, I was invited to give a talk, a lecture at a prestigious church in Toronto. but I didn't want to do it just because it was considered an honor to do so. And so I said no to that, and I decided instead to spend my time and energy investing in some immigrant pastors in my own city here in New York. Death, or the thought of death, or the realization that life is brief, can prevent us from overworking just to receive some kind of honor or title or more money. My friend Mark is a former pastor and is currently a professor of ministry at our denominational seminary in Calgary. And a number of years ago, Mark had this vision of being at the end of his life. So he's died in this vision, and he's standing before God, naked. And Mark says, I don't have any of my degrees in my hands. I don't have any of the books I've written. No worldly achievements. I'm just standing naked before God. And one day, that will be true of each of us. We will be standing naked before God, no resume in hand, no titles, no worldly awards or honors to cling to, just us and God. And as you, for a moment, contemplate that day when you're standing alone before God with no worldly achievement to cling to, and as you look into your heart, anticipating that day, what do you long for? What do you long to become? Dominic said, death will kill us, but the thought of death can save us. And Pico Iyer says that silence can really clarify what is most important in life. And so, even in this space, can I invite you to take a moment of silence, to join me in a moment of silence? And as you contemplate the day you meet God face to face in a spirit of prayer, ask yourself, what is my deepest desire? And ask yourself, what kind of person do I long to be? And if something rises in your heart in terms of the person you long to become, name that desire in prayer. Say, God, help me to become, and then just fill in the blank. And I pray that your prayers will come to pass and that you'll live into those longings. And like the psalmist, may God teach you to number your days that you may gain a heart of wisdom.